Covenant theology is a movement within Reformed theology, or a specific aspect of Reformed theology that tries to define redemptive history or explain redemptive history in terms of a successive covenantal structure, that God essentially makes covenants with humanity, and that is how he brings salvation about. And this serves as a way to explain all sorts of things within Reformed theology, so it connects to their views of the sacraments, their views of the church, and lots of other topics as well. It's kind of this unifying theme in Reformed theology that's very, very important for their whole theological system. And so the beginnings of covenant theology, those who are proponents of it oftentimes trace their heritage all the way back to St. Irenaeus or St. Augustine, who do speak about redemptive history in different places as a series of successive covenants that God makes with humankind. But covenant theology as a whole movement, really we could say, begins with Ulrich Zwingli, with the beginning of the Reformed Reformation. So Zwingli makes covenant this really central principle for himself when he's talking about infant baptism, and he's trying to connect the covenant that God makes with Abraham, where he circumcises or includes infants in the covenant, and then the new covenant where infants would be baptized to be included in the covenant. So there's this connection between the covenant with Abraham and the new covenant. That is developed a little more by John Calvin, but it's really after Calvin that covenant theology as a whole really starts to develop and kind of take on a life of its own. It's often sometimes called federal theology, which is referring to the same movement, though probably a little bit of a different aspect of that movement, dealing with federal headship, which connects Adam and Christ. But this is codified in then the Westminster Confession of Faith, in the Westminster Catechism. So this is 1646, 1648. And since then, it's been a very central aspect of Presbyterian and Reformed thought. So covenant theology essentially argues that God has worked in redemptive history through two basic covenants. Sometimes they'll speak about a third covenant, which is described as the covenant of redemption. Now, the covenant of redemption is something that happens in eternity past, where there is this agreement or this covenant between God the Father, the Son, and the Spirit, that redemption would be worked out and that the elect would be saved through the saving death of Christ, as well as the application of that death to the elect through the work of the Spirit. But then when we're talking about redemptive history, God makes these two essential kinds of covenants with humankind. The first is a covenant of works. And this is what God establishes with Adam in the garden. So the idea of a covenant of works is that God has set Adam up as a federal head of all humankind. He's a representative of humanity. And what Adam does is going to impact what happens to the rest of the human race, because he is the representative of humanity. And he takes on that representative role for us. And so Adam is basically offered eternal life, and he's offered eternal life through his obedience. So theoretically, if Adam were to be obedient to the law, perfectly obedient, and he didn't fall into sin, he would have been confirmed in righteousness, meaning that he would have been confirmed in eternal life, and he would have been in that state forever, and that would have also earned eternal life for all of us as well. And so that's what God offered to Adam before the fall. After the fall, all of that changes. Now Adam has messed things up, and so God then establishes the covenant of grace. This is said to begin in Genesis 3:15, where God gives this first promise of the gospel that there's going to be a seed of the woman that's going to crush the head of the serpent. And that's the first establishment of the covenant of grace. Now, it's argued that that same covenant is now reiterated in a bunch of different ways successively. So there's the covenant with Abraham, the covenant with David, and then the new covenant, which are all aspects, or what they would say are administrations of the covenant of grace. And so works before this, then grace. Now, in the covenant of grace, Jesus has to fulfill the covenant of works, or the covenant God established with Adam. And so the covenant of grace hinges upon the covenant of works, but it's Jesus' own obedience to the covenant of works that Adam broke, that now he, as the second federal head or representative of humanity, earns that gift of eternal life that was offered to Adam, but he failed to obtain it because of his sin. Now Christ has obtained it for the elect, and he's done that through his active and passive obedience, or his life under the law, as well as his death and then his resurrection following all of that. So then there's debate or discussion as to how the covenant with Moses fits into this. Some people have argued that the covenant with Moses is a kind of republication of the covenant of works. Meaning that there's this works principle that God says you can stay in the land that I've given you if you obey my laws. Others would argue that it's part of the administration of the covenant of grace. It's just this continuation of the Abrahamic covenant that really began with the proto-evangel in Genesis 3:15. So all of that is tied then to either the covenant of works or the covenant of grace, or oftentimes a little bit of both. There's debates about that. Covenant with Noah, same way. It's also debated whether it's part of the covenant of grace or a common grace covenant, which would be something a little bit different even from those. But these systems are referred to as bi-covenantalism, meaning that there are two covenants. That's covenant of works, covenant of grace, which is contrasted with an idea known as monocovenantalism, which some people also hold to, coming from the Reformed tradition, saying that everything is tied into the covenant of grace, including the Adamic administration. So that's a very brief overview of what covenant theology is. This is part of a series called the Theology Video Encyclopedia, where we just take give short explanations of various theological ideas for the curious. So if you like this, subscribe and check out the other videos in the series. We'll see you next time. God bless.